Right. So welcome everybody back to yet another cracking installment of the Matt Brown Show. This is the Secrets of Fail series, where we're talking about our big, hairy, audacious failures in business and everything we've learned from them. But with us on the line is the founder and chief strategy officer at an incredible influencer marketing company called CreatorIQ. Conor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Excited to be here.
No, it's all good, man. So why don't you kick us off, Conor? You've been giving me the front row seat to what you guys are up to, but what's your elevator pitch for our audience around the world today?
So we are an influencer marketing platform that works with some of the largest brands in the world. So like Disney, Red Bull, Google, Amazon, LVMH, Xbox, etc. And you can think of it like a CRM system for keeping track of all the influencers that are talking about you, sending payments, billing, briefing, competitive benchmarking, all that kind of stuff. Close to 1,000 clients, a little over 300 employees, raised about $100 million in financing, and we're the fastest and biggest player in the space.
Awesome. So what would you say is the problem that you guys are solving for brands? What are they trying to do?
Generally, they're trying to invest in and scale the way that they work with influencers. So if you're to look at a brand like, say, an Amazon, Amazon will have close to 100,000 influencers that talk about them each year. And they'll create close to 300,000 pieces of content about them during that time. So you're dealing with 1,000 pieces of content a day, and tens of thousands of relationships. It's just incredibly difficult to keep track of all that and to manage it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's fundamentally the kind of high level problem that we're solving, is brands that are investing this in a meaningful way and need to scale it, track it, measure it, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you give your podcast a punt as well?
We also have a podcast. It's called Earned, EARNED, by CreatorIQ. I host it. It's in the top 2.5% of all podcasts globally, growing close to 100% year over year. We just had the president of Mr. Beast on, the CEO of Forever 21, CMO at Gucci, as well as a bunch of others. So you should check it out.
Cool. Thank you. So what is your story of fail for our audience around the world today, Conor?
Yeah, so my story of fail was going from a company that was doubling year over year for 3 or 4 years in a row, to one that had flat growth over 2 years, right? So we had to cut out almost 50% of our revenue in 2018. So to add some context there, when we first started the company, we weren't very good at raising money. So we really had to focus on like building and selling software, right? Versus raising capital. And so that made us very capital efficient, which was great. And we grew very quickly. So we doubled every year for 3 or 4 years in a row. And then what happened was Instagram and Facebook got involved in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. That made them reevaluate the way that they offered their API to serve up data to be more privacy centric. And they shut down their API during that time. Now, the problem is that almost all of our customers were on month-to-month contracts. And so what happened was, we lost access to Instagram data, which was probably half the data we had in the platform. And, we saw a lot of churn. So a lot of customers leave. And so we went from a company that was growing very, very quickly to one that was churning a lot of customers. And we had, on top of that, we were about 50 employees at the time. We had another 8 to 10 grads that we had spent a lot of time recruiting, coming out of Harvard, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, et cetera, that were supposed to start in about 3 or 4 months as they came out of summer, had to rescind all their offers, had to do a small round of layoffs. And I think just from a pure kind of psyche perspective, you go from a company that feels like it's on fire to a company that is literally on fire. And so that was a really, really tough time. I remember sitting there in a meeting after we had thought we had really gotten through the tough stuff. And I was in the middle of the meeting. Of course, I opened an email like I shouldn't in a meeting with a direct report. And it was one of our largest customers. There was about $1 million a year customer that emailed us unexpectedly. It was like, need to cancel my contract immediately. And it was like, I went outside, called my wife, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we're going to make it through it. Right. And on top of that, we've been right in the middle of fundraising. We're about to raise a very large round. and had to shut all that down because of it. And we're really tight on cash. So it was a little bananas. So that was our big fail.
So Conor, what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, so there's a few things. I think there's what we learned, and then there's kind of how we made it out, right? Like, how did we survive, right? So from a survival perspective, we were really bad at like collecting accounts receivable, right? So we like went out and collected every dollar we could get. We moved to annual contracts with payment in advance so we could get cash flow coming into the business to help actually like fund payroll. We got really tight on expenses, right? So everything we spent, we were like really, really kind of smart and efficient about it. And made some really big pivots in the way we actually built our software. So went to something that was higher gross margin and more self-service versus we had some like services tied to it, right? To again, kind of cut down on costs. But I think the biggest thing that we learned coming out of it, and it was actually in some ways a blessing in disguise, is when we had that very negative event, we had a lot of churn. Well, the nice part about having a lot of churn at one time is you see patterns. So you look at the data, you go, a lot of these look the same. And what we figured out was that essentially, if you got 3 tweets a week, you don't really need influencer marketing software. You just don't need it, right? And so the way to kind of do that mathematically is if they had less than 50,000 followers on Instagram, we had a 90% chance of churning them as a client within 2 years. And so it's like, if I have basically a guaranteed chance of this customer failing, like, why would I even sign them up in the first place? And so we put that in as a threshold. The problem was that was a little bit over 40% of our revenue kind of fit that criteria, right? And so we had to cut out that 40% of our revenue and really zoned in on purely brands that fit that criteria. And what it did was it totally changed the way that we built our software, right? Because we're really focused, because the problems of Nike are very different than the problems of a startup company. Number one. Number two, so it focused our product roadmap. So we built things much more quickly. Second, you can be much more targeted and efficient in your marketing and sales because you know exactly who you're kind of going after, right? And so what it ended up resulting in was the business it took about 2 years to process that. But coming out of it, we were growing close to 60 to 70% year over year, insanely efficient. We didn't raise any money doing that during that period. So just insanely efficient growth. Our gross margins went from 66% up to 81%. Our retention rates went from low 90s to 116%, which is really good for that kind of business. And and then we actually got acquired. So I'm the co-founder of a company called Tribe Dynamics, got acquired by CreatorIQ for $70 million in stock and cash on $4 million raised.
So it's interesting, right? I mean, it's so fascinating. It's come up on the show a few times that your breakdowns are always your breakthroughs. You know what I mean? If you just decide to hang in there, that phone call to your wife. I mean, even today I was chatting to Gallen, he's also out of Hawaii, but long story short, I was saying because he has this idea of like, why not me, and because he had this thing around imposter syndrome, and we all have this kind of stock market graph journey, don't we? It's kind of like, and everybody's like, oh yeah, it's entrepreneurship's a hockey graph. It's like, no motherfucker, it's not. It's a shitty fucking stock market graph, and when it's down, it's fucking down, all right? And so when you're down, like it's a real, it's like the emotions are so heavy, dude. Like, and I can imagine that phone call to your wife, and like, I mean, the harder phone calls, honestly, were to the kids that were graduating, right? And they thought they had a job, and we're calling them 2 or 3 months before they have a job and saying, sorry, you don't have a job, right? And these were like high achievers, like really smart folks. And like, that was tough. That was super tough, right? But yeah, no, it is an up and down sport. And I think that, so another anecdote. So we used to, so when we first started the company, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. When we first started the company, the thing that we used to always tell ourselves is like, just don't die. So as a business, most outcomes are binary, right? You either die or you survive, and you more than likely get bought for a lot of money, right? As a business, it's generally how it works. So as long as you don't die,
you're very likely to do well, right? And so we used to just think about that all the time. Just how do we prevent ourselves from death? And that's kind of the most important part. But I don't know.
Well, I've been there as well, man. Like my previous company didn't have your kind of scale, but I mean, we were 55 people in Africa, and that's a big thing, you know, to have any,
totally.
I mean, we've got such amazing systemic issues that would make, you know, ivory towers, developed markets cringe when they went to bed at night. You know what I mean? Like the shit we have to deal with in Africa is heavy.
Totally.
You know, but like I've my previous company had to go through 2 layoffs, and you know, when it's, if I think, and I had the choice. I remember like my group MD was like, I'll tell them. I'm like, no, that's on me, you know, and it is on you. You have to do the hard things yourself.
Totally. Yeah, it's super tough. I mean, there's nothing good about layoffs.
No, it sucks. So let's go back to the future.
Yeah, for sure. So, what's the question? What's the plan?
Yeah, what would you do differently? Like if you could go back? Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on some of the things, but I mean, is there a thing that really jumps head and shoulders above all others?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were to give advice, right? Because again, I never would have really understood the power of that unless I had gone through it in some ways, right? And so if I were to have given advice to myself back then or to somebody else, it's like you really need to zone in on who is your ideal customer, right? Who's the customer that you really want to be targeting, and zone in and be uncompromising in your focus on that, right? I think it's very easy, particularly as an entrepreneur, to get enamored with the shiny object or the new thing or the new customer or the new kind of thing, product you want to sell. When the reality is there's, a very specific set of customers that are a very good fit for what you do, and you should really focus on those people. Because the secondary effect that happens, and we had started to see this at the time, was, so 40% of our revenue was toxic, right? We should have never signed these customers in the first place, it turns out. The problem is every single one of those people is going to leave that experience and say like, yeah, I tried out CreatorIQ and it didn't really work very well for me, right? And they take that with them and they remember that and they bring that into any future conversation. So if they're at a new company, they go, oh, wow, yeah, I signed up for CreatorIQ and it wasn't great. Like we didn't get the best out of it, right? When the reality is we never should have signed them up in the first place. And so limiting the number of negative experiences that people have with your product or your company, I think is really important. So
yeah. So I want to double click on that. How do you figure out who your customer actually is? Because tell us. Because if you're in the trough of disillusionment, like you get those early wins, like you think you're like, oh yeah, I'm there. And then you suddenly it plateaus and you're like, oh shit, I've actually got to figure out like who my freaking customer is. So what have you learned about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I'm trying to think of a good way to distill it. So I think, well, I'll give you another example versus like a method, right? So as an example, so we get acquired by CreatorIQ and we're looking at CreatorIQ's customers and we're trying to figure out who their ideal customer is because they've got a similar problem, right? They don't know exactly what it is. And so, it turns out the same basic principles held true in terms of brands, right? So brands, you got to have a good social audience. Otherwise, we should never sign you, right? The second thing, though, was like, okay, what about agencies, right? So you have agencies as customers too, but agencies don't really have an Instagram following, right? There isn't really one that exists. And so how do I know that influencers or social media is important to this agency? Like, how can I figure that out? And I was like, well, I feel like if it's important to them, like it should be on their website, right? Like they should have that somewhere on their website. And so I just went through every single agency and searched for their name and influencer, right? Or creator or whatever, to see whether or not that word showed up somewhere on their website. Turns out it was incredibly predictive of, who was going to be a successful customer and who wasn't, right? Based on kind of retention rates, to the point that it was like our retention rates, if you had it on your website, were like 110%, meaning those customers will spend 10% more this year than last year, versus if it wasn't, our retention rates were like 30%, right? Which would be like, basically you churn 90% of your customers within 2 years. And so again, that was like the second way that we did it. It was like, okay, it was a kind of a non-traditional way to do it. But the core truth was like, how do I know that this is business critical to this person or this company. I think in software, you tend to look for either daily usage or retention rates and then map it back. Say like, okay, how do I split this out and understand which ones are very likely to stick with me and which ones are not. But yeah, I don't know if that helps. That's how we did it though.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all approach, right? You just got to keep experimenting until you find something that works. I do feel like the idea of picking a niche is important. You know, like I think the only times anything's ever scaled from my side is when, you know, like the previous company, we're doing like lead gen for tech brands, whereas we were doing content for anyone, and we were just that flat thing. And then the moment we were like, cool, let's build our business around this one problem for this one customer, everything kind of took off. However, having said that, to your point around those influencers, well, those people with those, you know, less than 50,000 followers on Instagram, whatever, like the 40%, to your point, like reputationally, if you do niche, you have to make sure that you are able to consistently provide a service that delivers consistently, or you run the risk that word of mouth in that niche will, you know, start to negatively impact your business, which is what happened with us, because we would hand over, like, we had this inbound acquisition and then an outbound vetting team. And what they would do is they would basically filter the pipeline according to our clients' requirements. And then if like certain 10 sales qualified leads were generated, that would be the end of the campaign, and we would get paid whatever we got paid. So this is what happened. So never start a fucking lead gen business, because the clients will always blame you if they don't close. we're like, no, dude, we're here to give you the opportunity to close. We're not here to sell for you. That's not how this works. That's not why you pay us money. And unfortunately, you know, you do that for 5 years, word of mouth.
Yeah, it's tough, right? You run out of real estate eventually, in terms of people that will work with you. The one thing I'd say is, if I were to, you know, do a failure assessment on that business, right? I think the question would be, how do you optimize around leads that close, right? So instead of giving pure number of leads, how do you as a business optimize around like leads that close for those businesses? And then, because that's ultimately what their real goal is, right? Like it's not just leads, it's leads that turn to business. So again, I don't know how you solve that, but.
Neither do I. I don't have that problem anymore. So Conor, do you recommend any books or tools or resources for entrepreneurs to use?
Yeah, there's a ton. Trying to think of all the books that I would recommend. I've got a list on my LinkedIn if you're ever curious. It just says recommended reading. I think, you know, Hard Thing About Hard Things, Creativity Inc., all of the, God, why can't I think of his name? There's a bunch of business literature out there. Go to my LinkedIn, Conor Begley, CreatorIQ. You'll see a list there. There's a ton of them. Check them out.
Beautiful. Conor, thanks for being on the hot seat, bud. You did great. I can see why your podcast is popular.
Thanks, man. I try.
I know. Me too.
Awesome.
Awesome. Take it easy.